In hindsight, I can't believe how naive I was. The apartment's rent was suspiciously low, even for a studio. I should have realized there was a reason. The moving day felt like a chaotic whirlwind. Determined to prove my independence, I refused any help from my family, hoping to avoid confirming their doubts about me. By late afternoon, my body was in agony, muscles screaming, head pounding. Collapsing onto the bare mattress, I stared blankly at the ceiling fan, strands of damp hair sticking to my sweaty forehead as I peeled them away in disgust. A sudden knock at the door startled me, jolting me upright with a muttered curse. 2 young women stood hesitantly in the doorway. I'd foolishly left it open, forgetting the unspoken rule of open doors inviting company. I wasn't in the mood for introductions. The first girl, petite with a choppy black haircut, grinned widely. The second lingered behind her, absently fiddling with a box of cigarettes. "Hey," the first one greeted, nodding in my direction. Her tone was an intriguing mix of smoothness and rasp. "New here?" Rubbing my face with both hands, I groaned before replying. "Just moved in. Like, 5 minutes ago." "Cool," she responded, stepping inside without hesitation. Both girls ignored my apparent lack of enthusiasm. The one with the black hair casually trailed her fingers across my desk and plucked a ceramic duck from an unpacked box. "It's from my grandma," I blurted defensively. "Cute," she replied, holding the figurine up to examine it. "Has anyone told you yet?" the second girl asked abruptly. She had slipped the cigarette box into her jeans pocket and was now idly tugging at her long red braids. "Jesus, Nora. Give her a minute," the first girl interjected. "Well, she should know." "Yeah. But we haven't even gotten her name." I stared at them in disbelief. I hadn't even unpacked essentials like toilet paper, and here they were, invading my space, acting as if they knew me. All I wanted was a nap. "My name's Taylor," I said finally, the words dripping with exasperation. The one with red braids, Nora, plopped onto the bed beside me. "Have they explained the rules to you?" she asked. "What rules?" "Of course they didn't," she said with a smirk. "The rules of this place." I frowned, genuinely confused. Beyond the usual lease agreements, I wasn't aware of any special rules. I'd skimmed through the contract, signed it quickly, and handed it over to a surly landlord who reeked of cigarettes and seemed incapable of smiling. The rent was cheap, and that was enough for me to overlook any oddities. The other girl laughed nervously, trying to steer the conversation. "So, where'd you move from?" I ignored her. "What rules?" I pressed. Nora's grin widened, her expression almost gleeful as she bounced slightly on the mattress. "It's simple. Something strange happens every night," she explained, her voice taking on an eerie storytelling quality. "Out on the street, someone will scream for help. It's a different person every time, and it lasts for about an hour. But you're not allowed to help them." I blinked at her, feeling a faint shiver creep up my spine. "What?" "It's true," the other girl chimed in, pulling out my rickety desk chair and sitting down. "It happens at random times. We never know when." "Why not help?" I asked, skeptical and annoyed. She shrugged lightly, her expression tinged with sadness. "We don't know why," I scoffed, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. "Sounds ridiculous." "I don't believe you." The girl shrugged again, unbothered. "You don't have to. You'll find out soon enough." Her expression made me want to believe her. She seemed genuine, but I couldn't wrap my head around the possibility that they were telling the truth. It was too bizarre, too absurd. I knew this area wasn't the greatest, but it couldn't possibly be that bad. It had to be a joke, some hazing. "We'll come back later," Nora said decisively. "We'll show you." Before I could argue, she grabbed the other girl's wrist, and they disappeared down the hallway. I followed them to the door, watching as they strode away, murmuring to each other in hushed tones. Shaking my head, I closed the door behind them. That evening, as promised, they returned. But they weren't alone. They brought two guys with them. One was taller and well-built, wearing a tight black shirt and loose jeans. My eyes were drawn to the silver heart-shaped locket he wore. He greeted me with a warm smile and introduced himself as Alex. The second guy was shorter, rounder, and noticeably more anxious, sporting a buzz cut and baggy cargo shorts. His name was Benji. Nora entered carrying a bottle of wine and the same slightly crumpled cigarette pack from earlier. The girl I still didn't know looked at me with a mixture of apology and nervousness. They all sat down on my dusty floor near the window, gesturing for me to join them. Reluctantly, I sat between Alex and the nameless girl, torn between feeling annoyed at their intrusion and curious about my strange, insistent neighbors. "Do you all live in this building?" I asked cautiously, accepting the wine bottle as it was passed to me. "Yeah," Alex answered with a half-hearted smile. "This building is for the young crowd," Nora interjected, lighting a cigarette. It didn't even occur to me to tell her not to smoke inside. "We've been sorted out. Don't mind her. She's got a thing for conspiracy theories." "It's not a theory," Nora snapped, glaring at him. "Look at the patterns. Next door, it's middle-aged couples and families with kids but no grandkids. Across the street, it's seniors only. Not one 20-something in that entire building." "Her name's Mia," Alex said casually, glancing at the girl next to me. "So that was her name, Mia." I glanced at her, noting the smoky makeup around her eyes and the way her tied-up hair stuck out in messy, firework-like strands. "Stop staring," Mia muttered, reaching for the wine. "You'll scare her off." "I'm not scared," I replied defensively. Mia just shrugged, clearly unconvinced. The wine bottle made its rounds, and I listened to their banter. It was apparent they'd known each other for a long time. Even though they were in my apartment, I felt like an outsider in their dynamic. Alex asked if I had gone to college, and I admitted I had but dropped out. They nodded sympathetically, which somehow made me feel worse. By midnight, the alcohol had softened my edges, and my walls began to come down. I had to admit it was nice to feel included. I had resigned myself to solitude when I moved here, but this unexpected camaraderie gave me hope. I laughed at Benji and Nora's tipsy argument, sharing a cigarette with Mia as we blew the smoke out the open window. For a moment, I forgot why they were all here, until it happened. Suddenly, a loud alarm erupted from our phones, sharp and jarring like an Amber Alert. The sound wasn't just from our devices. It echoed throughout the neighborhood, a collective blaring from hundreds of phones. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. Everyone fell silent, their laughter extinguished instantly. I pulled out my phone, frowning at the glowing screen. "Do not interfere. It's starting," Alex whispered. His voice was unsteady, his eyes distant and unfocused. Benji placed a hand on his shoulder, offering quiet reassurance. I turned to Mia. Her brows were furrowed, and she stubbed out the cigarette against the windowsill, shrinking away from the scene. That chill returned, crawling up my spine and leaving me cold despite the warmth in the air. The atmosphere felt charged, almost alive, or maybe it was just my nerves. We sat there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. Just as I was about to ask what was going on, I heard it. At first, it was faint, distant, and barely audible. But soon it grew louder, closer, more urgent. A cry for help. "Please, someone help me." The voice was raw with desperation, sending a shiver through my entire body. Slowly, I leaned out the window, compelled to see it with my own eyes. to confirm someone was actually out there, just as they'd said. From my fourth-floor apartment, the street below was partially obscured, and I had to squint to make out the figure. Under the flickering streetlights, I saw him. An older man hunched over and moving aimlessly from door to door. He wore only a hospital gown over his pale, battered frame, and behind him trailed a dark smear of blood. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. "Please, I'm hurt," he called out. I turned to the others, my mouth agape. "What is this?" I shouted, my voice shaking. "What the hell is going on?" Mia reached out, her hand lightly touching my arm, trying to steady me. I jerked away from her. "Taylor, please," she said softly. "We have to help him," I cried. "Why can't we help him? He's just an old man." "We can't," she said firmly. "Trust me. We can't help him." Ignoring her, I leaned further out the window, ready to call to him. But just as I opened my mouth, I froze. The man below had stopped moving. He stood still, facing the building. His head tilted upward, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I felt them, locked onto me. A cold wave washed over me, like plunging into ice water. "Help me." He whimpered into the stillness of the night. Then he screamed. The sound that tore from his throat was inhuman. A desperate, tortured cry that made my stomach churn and brought tears to my eyes. Couldn't look away. That's when I saw it. The blood was coming from his arms, or rather, where his arms should have been. In their place were raw, mangled stumps, fresh and glistening. He didn't move except for a subtle shake and sway, but his gaze never left me. His screams shifted, forming broken words I could barely make out. "Please, please." Mia yanked me backward from the window. I landed hard on the floor, gasping in pain and terror. "What is that thing?" I whispered. My voice came out low, barely audible. "We don't know," Mia replied, her eyes fixed on Alex. He was crying now, and Benji clung to him as if afraid he might collapse. "We just know to follow the rules." "What happens if you don't follow the rules?" I asked, immediately regretting the question. Alex sobbed quietly, his body trembling. Outside, the older man's wails continued, chilling and relentless. Nora reached over and slammed the window shut, but it did nothing to silence the awful noise. "Do you want to tell her, or should I?" Benji asked, his voice flat as he turned to Alex. Alex shook his head, gripping his silver locket tightly, his fingers nervously twisting the heart-shaped pendant. Benji sighed and looked at me. "A couple of months ago," he began, "one of them got to Alex's girlfriend." Nora interrupted. "Her name was Shannon." "Sorry, her name is Shannon," Benji corrected. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat refusing to go down. "What happened?" I managed to ask. Benji shook his head, his expression grave. "We don't really know," he said. "We were all together when the screaming started. Usually we ignore it. No point in dwelling on it. But that night, Shannon said she saw something different. She started insisting she had to help. Before we could stop her, she ran outside." He paused, glancing at Alex, who sat motionless, his face a mask of silent grief. Outside, the man's screams began to fade, growing softer as they moved further down the street. "Then what?" I pressed my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged, his face blank. "Nothing. She just disappeared." I pressed my lips together, trying to make sense of everything. I had genuinely thought they were playing a cruel joke, but after what I had seen, I couldn't deny the truth. It was terrifying. Why doesn't anyone just leave? I asked. He shrugged again. Most can't afford it, or they just don't care anymore. Some have left, but we all signed NDAs with the lease, so no one ever hears about it. I frowned, racking my memory of signing the paperwork. Something like that did sound vaguely familiar. I'd skimmed over it, assuming it was standard legal jargon I wouldn't understand. Had I really signed a non-disclosure agreement without realizing it? After that, I told them I needed to sleep, desperate for some time alone to process everything. They understood, and one by one they said their goodbyes and left. As I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, May's expression lingered in my mind. How she had extinguished her cigarette and backed away from the window when the alarm started. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. The following weeks were challenging. I spent more and more time with my neighbors, and their warnings proved true. I didn't see anyone over the age of 30 in the building. The other tenants were constantly coming and going, but settling in was more complicated than I anticipated. The others had grown accustomed to it. They cared. It was apparent, especially with Alex, who looked perpetually shaken. But they had also lived with it for long enough to sigh, close the blinds, and distract themselves when it happened. In time, I began to imitate them. Pretending it was normal helped a little, as strange as that sounds. Moving out wasn't an option for me. I was still living off my dwindling savings, a college dropout without a job. Every night brought a new horror. Sometimes the figure outside seemed human. Other times they barely resembled anything alive. Some were drenched in blood, their clothes tattered and grotesque. Others appeared almost ordinary, but the children were the worst. They would stumble and run like wounded animals, their cries piercing the night as they banged on doors, begging for help. Some tried different tactics, screaming, "They're coming," or "I don't want to die." Others whimpered apologies like, "I'm sorry, there were so many children." One night, I woke to a different kind of alarm. It wasn't the one from our phones. This was louder, blaring through the streets, the red glow of an outside light flashing through my window. I didn't dare look. The fear of what I might see kept me frozen in bed, my head buried beneath my pillow as I willed myself back to sleep. Over time, I became familiar with all the theories, most of them coming from Nora. She was convinced we'd been chosen as part of some twisted government experiment. Maybe there are bets on which buildings interfere the least, she once speculated while walking back from a coffee run. She pointed at the corners of the hallway. "Cameras everywhere," she muttered. I didn't know if I believed her. I preferred spending time with Mia. We would sit on the front steps, smoking and watching people pass by. It was surreal how normal the neighborhood looked during the day. Bright, lively, and entirely at odds with the horrors of the night. Mia didn't talk much about the rules, and I didn't press her. Mostly, we sat in quiet companionship. Just as I started to feel a semblance of comfort, it happened. It started with a birthday cake. "Happy birthday!" Matteo cheered as Mia walked through the door. He blew into a party horn, the paper unfolding and smacking Alex on the side of the head. Startled, Mia clutched her chest. "Jesus Christ. You know I hate surprises," she groaned. Nora laughed, setting a chocolate cake on the dresser. It was decorated with sprinkles and bright pink icing that read, "Happy birthday, Mia." She threw her arm around Mia's shoulders. "How does it feel?" she teased. "Awful. That's the spirit." "Enough already," Matteo cut in, weaving between them. "Let's eat some cake, then hit the bars." I learned that bar hopping was their birthday tradition. Despite the rules, there was no curfew here, though they claimed it was safest to be home by 10:30 p.m. Most nights, they were back before the alarms or stayed out elsewhere. We each had a slice of cake. The guys took shots in the kitchen while I watched Nora fuss with Mia's hair. I wasn't much of a partier. I'd spent most of my college bar nights in the smoker's corner outside. But the circumstances felt different now. I joined them as we piled into Mateo's car. The space was cramped, and I was acutely aware of how close I was to Mia, my other shoulder pressed against the car door. Mateo's music blared at full volume, the bass thumping in my ears. The car smelled of tobacco and perfume as we sped down the freeway. But despite the chaos, it was lovely. Really nice. I found myself laughing along with them, and when Mia slid her hand under my elbow, I looped my arm around hers without hesitation. For the first time in a while, I felt genuinely happy. As expected, the bars they picked weren't exactly my kind of scene, but unlike my college days, I could handle it this time. I took shots, followed them out for smoke breaks, and even danced under the dim purple lights until my feet throbbed inside my chunky heels, likely covered in blisters. By the time we made it to the third bar, I couldn't even feel the pain anymore. At that third bar, we crammed into an old photo booth, with Nora reluctantly feeding $5 into the slot. Laughing and flushed, we crowded around the tiny camera. Once the photo was printed and slid into the tray, the others pushed through the red curtains. But before I could follow, Mia grabbed my wrist. Her long, baby blue nails brushed my skin, sending a shiver up my arm. "You didn't get me a birthday present," she whispered, her breath warm against my face. If I'd been wearing my glasses, they would have fogged up. "Yeah, well, I started to joke, but she interrupted me with a kiss. It was nice, and then it wasn't. "Hey!" Alex's voice cut through the haze, calling my name as he pushed through a crowd of leather-jacketed men to get to me. "Taylor, where's everyone else?" I blinked, looking around. Just a moment ago, they'd all been there, but now the others were nowhere in sight. I shrugged, still disoriented. "Why? What's going on?" He finally broke free from the swaying crowd, and I got a good look at him. He seemed nervous, his face flushed and beads of sweat forming at his hairline. Pulling his phone from his pocket, he held it out for me to see. At first, I saw his home screen. A picture of him with a strawberry blonde girl, both holding beer bottles and grinning. Then I noticed what he was pointing to, the time. 1:47 a.m. "It's getting late," he said quietly. "We need to find the others and leave." I understood immediately. He was worried. It was past 1 a.m., and there hadn't been an alarm yet. That was unusual. The bars would be closing soon, and he wanted to make it back before anything happened. Together, Alex and I navigated through the crowd. I was buzzed and embarrassingly clumsy, stumbling over my own feet. Had I really drunk that much, or was I just that much of a lightweight? We found the others outside, chain-smoking. Alex quickly explained the situation while I swayed unsteadily. The drive back was tense. Mateo's music was barely audible, and the lively chatter and jokes from earlier were gone. The atmosphere was heavy, unspoken, but undeniable. Something felt wrong. Alex drove fast, his hands tight on the wheel as we sped through the dark streets. May reached for my hand just as he careened around the final corner, and we caught sight of our apartment building down the road. That's when it happened. All of our phones buzzed simultaneously, the familiar alarm blaring. Nora let out a startled shriek from the back seat. "Do not interfere." Mateo turned, holding a finger to his lips. "Has this ever happened before?" From their expressions, I didn't think it had. It was different now, sitting in the car, compared to being in my room, where I could pull the curtains and drown them out with headphones. I felt powerless and insignificant, like a fly caught in a vast, intricate web. The neighborhood was the spider. Alex slowed the car to a crawl barely 5 miles an hour. The silence was suffocating. No one spoke, Not even a breath seemed to escape. Under the pale glow of the streetlights, I could see Alex's face in profile. He was pale, unnervingly still. If I hadn't seen his knee pressing the brakes, I might have thought he was a mannequin. The car rolled to a stop. Following his gaze, I looked down the street and saw it. A silhouette. It was distant, its shape indistinct, but it was clearly human-like. It stumbled awkwardly, limping toward us in the middle of the road. In the crushing silence, its voice carried faintly but urgently. "Help me, Alex," Nora hissed. Turn the car around, but Alex didn't move. His pale face remained fixed forward, his expression unreadable. It didn't make sense, but deep down I understood. It was too late. There was no escaping now. "Help me, please, help." As it drew closer, I could make out more details. The figure was a girl, her voice trembling with desperation. She wore a white nightgown, much like the older man's hospital gown from the first night. It was stained with dark red blood. I couldn't tell if it was fresh or dry, and I didn't know why that detail mattered to me. "Maybe," May whispered beside me, her voice trembling. "Maybe if we stay quiet and duck down, it won't see us." It felt hopeless, but it also felt like our only option. I nodded, crouching behind the passenger seat, my knees aching from the awkward position. The others followed suit, except Alex. He remained still, his eyes fixed ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was so faint I almost didn't hear it. "Shannon." The single word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mateo broke the silence. "What?" "Shannon," Alex repeated, his voice trembling as he turned to look at Mateo. "That's Shannon." Peering over the seat in front of me, I squinted into the dim light. The figure was drawing closer, and now I could see it. Strawberry blonde hair, a round face, short legs. It was the girl from Alex's phone lock screen. The girl who had vanished. "Shannon," May whispered beside me, her voice breaking. "Man," Mateo said slowly, his words faltering. "I know what you're thinking. Please don't do it. Do not get out of this car." Alex didn't seem to register his words. He looked distant, as though his mind had left the car entirely. "I have to help her," he murmured, just as another agonizing cry tore through the air. "Help me. Help. Please. Someone. It hurts." The figure was getting dangerously close now, but it still didn't seem to notice the car. His cries grew louder, more frantic with every step. "I have to help her," Alex repeated, this time with more conviction. A flicker of life had returned to his face. Mateo reached out, grabbing Alex by the sleeve. "Alex, listen to me. That is not Shannon." Alex's tear-filled eyes burned with defiance. "I know Shannon. That's her. I know you do, man. I know you miss her. But this isn't what you think it is. Please don't do this." Their voices rose, panic and anguish spilling into every word. Beside me, May pressed closer, trembling violently. From somewhere behind us, I could hear Nora whimpering, though I couldn't see her from my spot. The figure stopped abruptly just in front of the car. It tilted its head to the left, then the right, as though sniffing the air. The argument between Alex and Mateo ceased instantly. The tension was suffocating, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might break free from my chest. Now I could see her face clearly, and I understood why she hadn't noticed us. Her face was streaked with blood and torn flesh. Her eyes, once bright and familiar in Alex's photo, were gone. The empty sockets looked as though they'd been hollowed out with a crude instrument. She sobbed, drool spilling from her slack mouth, but no tears came. What happened next was too quick to stop. Alex wrenched his arm free from Mateo's grip and reached for the car door handle. "Alex, no!" Mateo yelled, slamming his hand down toward the lock. But he missed. Alex flung the door open and stumbled onto the pavement. The thing's head snapped toward him, and it let out an ear-piercing scream. But instead of charging, it recoiled, backing away in terror. It flailed its arms in front of itself as though fending off an invisible attacker, its head whipping around wildly. Then, the alarm sounded. I heard the same blaring noise before, but this time, it was unbearable. Red lights flashed from every street lamp, bathing the road in a harsh, pulsating glow. Mateo launched himself into the driver's seat, his foot slamming on the gas. The tires screeched as the car sped away. Nora screamed at him from the back seat, pleading for him to turn around. May sobbed into her hands. I stayed silent, frozen in disbelief. I didn't understand what I had just seen. As we tore down the road, I couldn't stop myself from looking back. Through the flashing red lights, I caught a glimpse of a van pulling around the corner. Then everything disappeared into darkness. That was a week or two ago. I'm not sure anymore. Time's been hard to track since then. None of us have talked much about that night. Of course, we tried calling the police, but you can guess how that went. Nothing came of it. Whatever this is, it's far more significant than any of us realize. I don't know if it's some twisted experiment, a sick game, or something else entirely. I'm planning to move back in with my parents next week, even if it means listening to their endless lectures. After that, I'll figure out my next steps. I still don't know what we saw that night. Was it really Shannon? Or was it something pretending to be her? Either possibility chills me to the bone. All I know is that last night, I heard Alex's voice outside my window. He was crying, pleading for help. I didn't interfere. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for more stories in the coming weeks. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Take care and have a good night.